Well, thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon on what looks like it's starting to turn out to be a very beautiful afternoon. It certainly seems beautiful to me. I teach in Minnesota, and on Monday it was snowing. So people are saying, gee, you got kind of cold weather here in Berkeley, and I'm saying, no, this is great. This is beautiful weather. I will be sticking fairly close to my text just to get through a bunch of material in this first part. And then I hope that later on, it sounds like we have 3 hours together, so there's going to be plenty of time for questions and discussion a bit later as we go on. So, in the last 5 years, we've seen the rise of big data, smartphones, Google, a variety of other devices and programs. We've just become immersed in a world of digital information. And these advances in computer technology have been coupled with advances in biogenetics, such as the Human Genome Project, new techniques in genetic manipulation and replication, and at the same time, our basically Newtonian view of matter as made of basic building blocks has given way to a strange quantum world where particles turn into waves and uncertainty reigns. And this is a world in which results seem to be based on what the observer is looking for, the type of information that the observer is looking for, rather than some static objective reality. And so this has led many thinkers to begin to ask whether it isn't time to replace matter as the basic building block of the world with information. To say, you know, really, it all comes down to information in the end. That it's information that lies at the core of the universe. If this is so, then are we nothing but information? What lies at the center of our sense of self, making each of us the individual that we are? In 1994, the molecular biologist and Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick came up with what he called the astonishing hypothesis, a little piece of which is on the screen there. Crick wrote that your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You're nothing but a pack of neurons. The you that Crick refers to as our self, located in memories, ambitions, hopes, emotions, and actions, is in this statement a sense that is of self that is purely material. He says you are an assemblage of neurons, and neurons are material. However, advances in computer technology have led people to rephrase Crick's astonishing hypothesis and to say, you know, it's not really your neurons that you are, it's the pattern of the connections between those neurons. It's the messages that those neurons pass back and forth. Those are the things that make up your hopes, your ambitions, your memories, your dreams. So in a sense, you are not the hardware of your brain, but the software that organizes it and keeps it running. And in that sense, Crick was getting at the beginning of an idea that says you are nothing but information. This vision of the human person as information is appealing in a lot of ways. For one thing, it allows for a simple concept of human individuality because everyone's informational pattern is somewhat different. Even more, since this information is reproducible, it suggests a new form of immortality in which we could port the information that makes up ourselves to some new platform, either into a computer or maybe into a clone, so that we could go on after our bodies die. At least this is the dream of many. Well, rooted in the materialist worldview, this vision introduces a quasi-Cartesian dualism that separates the mind from the body and locates the self wholly in the mind. However, this cybernetic view of the human person fails to account for the embodied nature of both cognition and emotion, and I'm going to argue that it fails to encompass what it means to be fully human, that we are neither just a mind nor just a body, but we are an inseparable mind in a body, the mind being both a part of the body and a product of our body, and existing within a larger physical and cultural environment. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this new vision of immortality. But basically, we're going to be asking these two questions. Can the body be separated from the brain? If so, what would we get? And where is the locus of the self then? Is it in this pattern of information that makes up our thoughts and our personality, or is it somehow rooted to our bodies? Here's a man, this is Ray Kurzweil, who definitely thinks that we are our minds, and he's probably been the most frequent and eloquent proponent of this idea of porting our minds up into computers, into a new platform. There's a piece of his quotation on the screen, but let me read a slightly larger version to you. Kurzweil writes, "Up until now, our mortality was tied to the longevity of our hardware. When the hardware crashed, that was it. For many of our forebears, the hardware gradually disintegrated, or deteriorated before it disintegrated. As we cross the divide to instantiate ourselves in our computational technology, our identity will be based on our evolving mind file. We will be software, not hardware. As software, our mortality will no longer be dependent on the survival of the computing circuitry, as we periodically port ourselves to the latest, ever more capable personal computer. Our immortality will be a matter of being sufficiently careful to make frequent backups." It reminds me of the old joke where Jesus and the devil had a computing competition. And, they're both banging out code, and finally God says, "Time up," And just at that point, there's a power failure. PG&E goes out, and the devil's code disappears. And Jesus says, "Well, no, here's my program, no problem." And the devil says, "Whoa, wait a minute, that's not fair. How come mine crashed when the computers crashed and his didn't crash?" And God said, "Well, that's easy. Jesus saves." I was using it with my students to say, back up your stuff. So anyway, this gives new meaning to the idea of a personal computer. But we would be in a computer, and we just got to make sure we make lots of backups, in case PG&E has a problem. Now, dreams of moving from a mortal biological body to a quasi-immortal existence in cyberspace aren't confined to Ray Kurzweil. He's not the only one who's thinking this. It's actually one of the main platforms of the post-human, or what's sometimes called the transhuman vision. Kurzweil suggests that we should be able to do this by 2045. 10 years ago, he thought we'd be able to do this by 2030. So he has a little bit of a sliding timeline here, as we don't seem to quite get there. But he believes that by 2045, we will approach this thing he calls the singularity, which is a time when computing power will have gotten so great and artificial intelligence will have made so much progress that he believes that computers will outstrip human thinking, and that actually if humans are going to continue on the planet, we had better do so as a part of computer technology. He writes, "The singularity will allow us to transcend the limitations of our biological bodies and brains. We will gain power over our fates. We will be able to live as long as we want. We will fully understand human thinking. Whoa. And the non-biological portion of our intelligence will be trillions and trillions of times more powerful than unaided human intelligence. It's a big, grand vision for us. MIT's Rodney Brooks sides with Kurzweil. He believes that human and machine intelligence will merge in the future, and that we'll start replacing more and more of our biological parts with computers. So his approach is a little different. Instead of simply porting our brain into a computer, he believes we'll sort of become increasingly more and more cyborgs. We'll start to just get more and more and more mechanical parts until we finally sort of merge into the machines. Dr. Sebastian Sung, who is working on reverse engineering the human brain as part of the Connectome project, has suggested that mapping all the synapses of the brain could be stored in information, and that at some future time these could be reinstantiated, either in a computer or in a human clone. Now, before we can do any of this, we're going to have to find some way of capturing and symbolizing this information. In other words, we must understand how the brain functions, much in the same way that we now understand how our genetic code functions. Okay? While the Human Genome Project was a large and ambitious undertaking, reverse engineering the human brain is vastly more ambitious. It's estimated that the brain contains roughly 80 to 90 billion neurons, each of which can be potentially connected to thousands of other neurons. These connections, then, are not permanent. They're constantly changing. As we experience new things, as we forget other things, as we drink a couple of glasses of wine, and as we simply think. So these connections keep changing in our brain all the time. To make matters even more complicated, electrical impulses move from neuron to neuron enhanced or impeded by a continual bath of neurochemical transmitters, okay? Such as, I'm sure you've heard of dopamine and serotonin and the roles that those play in the brain. Nevertheless, in 2013, President Barack Obama announced a $3 billion, 15-year federally funded research program that would attempt to map the neural pathways of the brain. At the same time, the European Commission announced its own 10-year human brain project devoted to creating a computer simulation of the brain. So they're approaching this project in two different angles. The American angle is to say we're going to try to map how the brain works the same way that we mapped the human genome. The European project is sort of starting not from the brain, but from the computer, and saying we're going to try to build up from the computer until we have a model of the human brain. But both are going for basically the same thing, a way of understanding exactly how our brain works. I think it is extremely unlikely that either project will meet its goal. Well, we understand the functioning of a single neuron, or small groups of neurons, and we can use fMRI machines and PET scans to map blood flow in major sections of the brain. We're missing the middle ground. We don't have the understanding of how large chains of neurons function, nor do we have any idea how these chains represent a thought or a memory. And this does not consider even an underlying ontological question. Juan Enrique, the managing director of Excel Venture Management, writes, "But if it turned out that all data erases upon transplant, that knowledge is unique to the individual organism, in other words, that there is something innate and individual to consciousness, knowledge, intelligence, then simply copying the dazzlingly complex connectome of the brains into machines would likely not lead to an operative intelligence." In other words, there may be something still missing even if we manage to get past that complexity problem and our knowledge gaps in the middle and understand the human brain, it still doesn't guarantee that simply copying it as information is actually going to capture it. We may capture only, it's sort of like taking a photograph of something, captures how it looks, but it doesn't capture the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Okay? So there's some worries here. In other words, don't count on being able to upload your brain to a computer by 25. Be a little skeptical on that. Okay, but let's assume, I could stop right now. I'm not going to, though. I think we haven't gotten any theology yet. So let's assume, for the sake of further discussion, that eventually we will fully understand the workings of the human brain and that we could capture this in informational terms. While proponents of this vision staunchly deny the existence of a soul, there's something oddly Cartesian going on here. If we are nothing but information, in particular information that can be ported to another platform, then the self, while generated by the workings of the body, is ultimately separable from the body. So we're returning to a very old philosophical system that says self is somehow in the body. Now, this view, this computerized view of the self as information, does avoid some of the philosophical critiques of Cartesian dualism. For one thing, it doesn't assume the pre-existence of the soul. In this viewpoint, the information that becomes us, you could almost say, well, the soul is post-existence to the body. We generate it through the body. It doesn't have to be pre-existent, but it's still separable in the same way that Cartesian dualism separated our soul from our body. On the positive side, of course, is the idea that this would give us a hope for some sort of quasi-immortality. As the computer scientist Daniel Hill notes, I'm as fond of my body as anyone. But if I can be 200 in a body of silicon, I'll take it. Okay? The soul as information also counters several other critiques that are usually leveled after Cartesian dualism. As an emergent property of the brain, this sort of soul violates none of the tenets of biological or neurological development. Nor need we look for any explanation of how it interacts with the physical brain. This has been one of the major critiques of Cartesian dualism, is saying, but you can't describe how this soul actually interacts with the physical brain. Well, in this version, it is the physical brain, okay? Viewed at least as the brain's content. Would we, however, like Hill, want to port our brains to computers? You see a show of hands? Anybody? Nobody? Nobody wants to do this. Well, I think you're fairly typical of most people. Michio Kaku, in his newest book, notes that if people are given the choice between high-tech and high-touch, they're going to go for high-touch every time. I mean, think about how, if you're having a reunion with a loved one, are you going to choose Skype or are you going to choose their physical presence? We'd go for the high touch. If somebody said to you, I can show you a perfect replica of the Taj Mahal, would you say, okay, fine, that's just as good as the real thing? No, we don't. We want the real thing. We want the Ding an sich. Okay? The other thing I often think about, which is my reason for thinking I don't want this to happen, is the following. I try to imagine how it would happen. So I think, okay, I'm going to go into the lab, they're going to put a lot of electrodes around my head, or maybe put me in some kind of machine that looks like an MRI machine, and it's going to clank and whir and all sorts of things, and then at a certain point, they'll roll me out and they'll say, thank you, Dr. Herzfeld, you can go now, we've got you. I'm still going to be right here. And at most, what's going to be in the machine is going to be some weird sort of doppelganger, that has my tastes and my memories, but I'm still going to be right here. And so that's going to be something different. And in fact, from the very moment that I get uploaded there, it and I are going to go like this. You know, because it's not going to have the same experiences that I'm going to have from that moment on. We're going to be two very separate entities. The other question, you know, I always ask my students is, because actually some of my computer science majors, when I ask for the show of hands, they go, oh yeah, way cool, you know, I'm ready. You know, and I say, okay, when are you going to do this? You know, maybe you should have done it at 15 when you thought you knew everything. Or maybe at 25, when you're kind of at the height of your cognitive powers, when you're at the height of your memory. Your memory's going to start fading after that, okay? Or maybe you want to wait until 65, when you have a whole lifetime of memories and experiences. Don't wait too long, you know, you might lose your chance, or your mind might start having senior moments that you don't want in the machine, okay? And then I say, better yet, why not do it at all of those ages? But now, which one is you? Is it the one from 15, 25, 65? Are they all you? You know, Edwin Kurzweil says, back up, you know, make sure you make frequent backups. And I say, well, you know, to be safe, why not immediately port yourself to at least 5 different machines? In case one malfunctions, you've got the other 4, but now which one is you? Okay, so this raises some, you know, very interesting ontological questions. What's missing from this viewpoint? Well, obviously, I think what's missing is the body's matter. Okay? The same thing that is missing from the standard Cartesian dualism, and that has led Christianity to posit a resurrection of the body rather than simply immortality of the soul. Bodies matter. Without a body, we do not have a self. Our bodies give us continuity over time. That keeps us from having that problem of, you know, is it 15-year-old me, 25-year-old me, 45-year-old me? They are necessary for a fully human intelligence. I'm going to talk about that more in a second. Moreover, our bodies play a crucial part in our ability to feel, to have empathy, and therefore to love. The biblical tradition is clear that the human being is an integrated whole, one that is human precisely in being both a body and spirit. In the creation story in Genesis 1, humans are said to be created in the image of God. This image has been interpreted by theologians variously. There's many, many interpretations, some of them rather unusual. The one I always chuckle at is the one that says, we image God because we stand upright on 2 feet. And I thought, whoa, how did you know that God stands on 2 feet? But there are many ways. But actually, Bob helped me to categorize these ways in 3 different categories. Okay, the first, following Aristotle, sees God's image in us as our mental abilities or a rational intellect. Aristotle called us the rational animal. This was the one property that he said we didn't share with animals, and so early Christian theologians followed that and said, therefore, this must be the property that we share with God. And this is, you see this in Augustine, you see this strongly in Aquinas, even in Calvin and Luther, you still see this strong emphasis on rationality. However, in recent scholarship, this view has been supplanted by another. It's moved from this sort of static, trait-based view towards one that is more dynamic and agency-based. And part of this move was sparked by the work done by biblical scholars around the turn of the previous century in looking at extra-biblical sources. Gerhard von Rad writes, the divine likeness is not to be found either in the personality of man in his free ego, in his dignity, or in his free use of moral capacity or mental capacity, but in man's physical being, precisely because it is only through our bodies that we have agency in the world. Further, he writes, the divine likeness consists in the fact that man was invested with might at creation. In Genesis 1:26, we are told that man is to be created in the divine image, that he may control the whole of creation. Ben Rod is looking both at the Genesis 1 text, where you notice that it said, right after it says, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, it then says, and let them have dominion over the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, etc. So he says, look, it's in the context, it's in the same sentence with all this dominion. Therefore, the image probably has to do with our active dominion. Scholars at this time were also looking at extra-biblical sources, particularly places where it said someone was in the image of the king. And they found that this was often applied to a deputy or a vice regent who might be sent out in the provinces where the king was absent or the emperor was absent. And they would say, this person is the image of the king or the image of the emperor. So it's, the fact that we act in God's stead on earth that biblical scholars turn to. There's also a second interpretation. Our bodies confer more than the ability to act. They also provide the locus for relationship. Thus, Klaus Westermann notes that while image language is used in Egyptian and Mesopotamian sources to denote a representative of the king, these sources apply the designation to a single person who represents a higher power than the rest of the community. But if humankind is, as a whole, designated in God's image, who are we supposed to represent God to if we're all in God's image? Okay? So Westermann asks that question, and he moves to an understanding of God's image as not hierarchical, constituted within the web of our relationships with God and with one another. So he says, if we are all corporately the image of God, then that image is found in the web of our relationships, in that corporate body that we represent. So Karl Barth takes this a step further. He looks at the Genesis text and he says, well, first of all, the image text says, let us create man in our image. And he sees that as prefiguring the Trinity, that it is a triune God speaking to God's self, rather than to some heavenly court, and saying, it's our image. We are a relationship, that God's very self is relational. And this then strengthens the idea that Westermann had that says that no one can image God by themselves. We only image God corporately in the relationships themselves that we have with each other. Now, while I raised some questions about Barth's understanding of the Genesis text, because I have a feeling that the priestly writer, as a good Jew, did not have a triune God in mind in writing that text. Still, this does reflect the centrality Christianity gives to relationships, and most of all, to love. Okay? So here's a quotation from Karl Barth. He says, in God's own being and sphere, there is a counterpart, a genuine but harmonious self-encounter and self-discovery. Humans are the repetition of this divine form of life. That in God's own self, there's relationship. We mimic this when we are in relationship to each other. So, if we look at these views of the image of God in us, we see this threefold thing: intelligence, agency, and relationship. And it wasn't until today that I actually looked at this slide and said, it's kind of interesting where I put the word relationship, but we'll leave that up to your imaginations. What kind of relationship we're looking at here? Actually, we're incomplete without all three of these. They together capture the complexity of our human nature. We're neither just a mind nor just a body, but a mind that is both part and product of our human body and exists embedded within the larger environments of our physical and cultural worlds. Now, the interesting thing is this has become clear to computer scientists as well. And although computer scientists initially thought that intelligence was something separable from any kind of body, that we could get artificial intelligence merely by figuring out what are the rules that we think by, they found out very quickly that that gives you a very limited form of intelligence. It gives you a form of intelligence that's very good in rule-based areas. So it's given us good chess-playing programs. It's given us programs that can, be whizzes at calculus, and other types of calculations. It's given us various expert systems that can mimic the work of an expert. But all of these are successes because they are areas where human thought is very rule-based. But a lot of human thought does not seem to be quite that rule-based. And the idea of capturing everything that we do in rules turned out to be much more complex than people thought. The last real project that went in this direction was Doug Lennett's Psych project. He called it Psych as a shortening of encyclopedic. And he believed that he really could just put all the information that a human being has and just tons of rules into a computer and get it to act like a human being. He worked at it for a good decade and found that it was just impossible. That the amount of information that people had was too vast to put inside a computer in this way. So the AI world has turned more to the idea that computers, if they're going to have minds like ours, are going to have to learn like we do. And therefore, they're going to have to be in an environment. And to be in an environment, they're going to have to be embodied. So embodiment is one of the buzzwords currently in the AI community. Rob Pfeiffer and Matthias Hoffman of the University of Zurich note that low-level cognitive functions such as locomotion or visual processing necessitate a triumvirate of brain, body, and environment. Further, they believe more complex cognitive processes and planning are built on these simpler bases. Thus, while we can mimic certain higher-level processes, they can't really develop without a physical platform. Cognition requires, and is in fact structured through feedback from the environment. Think about how we learn. We do an awful lot of our learning in play as children. Think of a child playing in a sandbox. She's learning a lot about gravity. She's learning a lot about different substances. She's learning something about shape and size and fluid dynamics. Okay? And if she's playing in the sandbox with other kids, she's learning even more. She's learning about relationships. Okay? Psychologist Cristiano Castelfranchi believes that the bulk of human intelligence arises out of the necessities of social life. As social animals, much of our knowledge is embedded in organizations, procedures, and even tools, and it's corporate and relational. John Haugeland writes the following: think of how much knowledge is contained in the traditional shape and heft of a hammer, as well as in the muscles and reflexes acquired in learning how to use it. Though again, no one need ever have thought of it. Multiply that by our food and hygiene practices, our manner of dress, the layout of buildings, cities, and farms. To be sure, some of this was explicitly figured out, at least once upon a time, but a lot of it wasn't. It just evolved that way because it worked. Yet a great deal, perhaps even the bulk of the basic expertise that makes human intelligence what it is is maintained and brought to bear in these physical structures. It's neither stored nor used in the head of anyone. It's in their bodies, and even more, it's out there in the world. So most of our knowledge, functioning and self-understanding, is shaped by the specifics of our bodies in interaction with our environment. Artificial intelligence has made the mistake of viewing the computer as an individual actor rather than part of some relational web. This bodes poorly for the continual growth of a brain uploaded to a silicon platform. It's going to have to still be able to interact with the environment and with other brains, other beings. So you're going to have to find a place to do that, either by making it able to get around in the real world, or by a lot of interaction in cyberspace, which of course is the dream of many of the transhumanists. Okay, now what about love? Okay, let's come to this. The importance of the body extends beyond the difficulty of gathering intelligence without a body. As Christians, we believe that love for God and for one another is ultimately more important than intelligence. So does love require a body? Obviously, certain expressions of it seem to. And I'm often reminded of an old Star Trek episode in which the Enterprise comes in touch with a civilization that has evolved beyond the need for material bodies. So this civilization, the entities are thought, immaterial thought itself. And these entities somehow get onto the Enterprise and they possess certain members of the crew with interesting results. But one of the subplots in this is about two of these entities that love one another. And, when questioned, well, why did you do this? Why did you take over our bodies this way? They say, because for eons we've been dying to be able to physically express our love. We can't do it without a body. Okay? We all know that love at its fullest involves more than information. Letters, email, phone calls, even the best Skype connection, those are poor substitutes for the physical presence of the loved one. The ability to touch one another is not the only thing that gets lost in informational substitutes. For one thing, we are only beginning to understand the role of smell in emotional connection. But it seems to play a very big role. Perhaps the feeling of a touch or the information of a smell could be simulated, but I want to talk about something different, about compassion in the form of empathy. I believe that this requires a body, that we cannot fully experience emotion, and without true emotion we cannot truly have empathy for one another if we don't have a body. Simon Baron-Cohen defines empathy as follows. It's our ability to identify what someone else is thinking and feeling and to respond with an appropriate emotion. Genuine empathy requires recognition and response. We have to see what's happening to the other person. We have to respond in some way. But hidden between these two motions of recognition and response is emotion. As Simon Baron-Cohen said, we have to respond with an emotion, okay, with the appropriate emotion. In other words, to quote Bill Clinton, I need to feel your pain. Okay? How are computers at this? You can answer that yourselves, right? Facial recognition software is making a beginning towards identifying anger, delight, sadness, disgust, etc. So we can do the recognition part to some extent in the computer. We can do the response part to some extent. But can the computer feel your pain? Can it respond with an appropriate emotion? Well, to ask that question, we have to ask the next question. What is an emotion. Okay, so I turn to Jerome Kagan for this question. What then is an emotion? And Kagan says we have 4 steps to a genuine emotion. Perception of a stimulus, change in feeling that is sensory, appraisal, and response. Okay? So he says, for example, the first one, perception of a stimulus, often happens on a subconscious level. You will hear a rustling. You're up walking through the far reaches of Tilden, let's say. You hear a rustling in the bushes. Before you have time to think, your heart's going to start speeding up. Okay, your palms might get a little sweaty, you get that shot of adrenaline. Or think about those times in your car where you have kind of a near miss on the freeway, where somebody suddenly changes a lane and you're just, ooh, you know. Immediately you feel it in your whole body. Okay, so that's the second one. The perception of a stimulus happened, but it may not have consciously registered yet. You have that feeling, that change in feeling that is sensory, and then you appraise it and say, ooh, that might be a mountain lion in the bush. And then you respond with, fight or flight, right? Okay, so what's really important here, and I think what is missing for the computer, is stage 2. Without a body, the computer can perceive a stimulus, it can appraise that stimulus, it can respond, but it will not have a change in feeling that is sensory. Okay? Now, is this a problem in something like empathy? Or could you say, well, okay, no, a hollowed-out version of emotion is enough, as long as it perceives my emotion, appraises it, and responds appropriately. Is that okay? Well, think about a human being who would act this way. Suppose there's a human being who you notice over time never really feels your pain, sees something happen to you and bases their response purely on calculation. How would you label such a human being? What would you call them?
Sherlock Holmes.
Okay, Sherlock Holmes, yeah. What else might you call them?
A robot.
A robot.
A sociopath.
A sociopath, yeah. You'd probably think of them at best as being somewhat manipulative. Mm-hmm. This person is just calculating how to respond to me. It's not genuine, we would say. And there are people like that, and in fact, we do label them in DSM-5 as having a personality disorder. We no longer use the term sociopath, but that's the one in common parlance. These are people who show a lack of remorse, a lack of empathy. I find number 3 very interesting, a lack of irrational dreams or delusions. Well, that sounds like computers to me. A lack of anxiety, a superficial charm, manipulative, and possessing a compelling gaze that does not break off in embarrassment. And so, I find myself thinking, okay, maybe we could have a relationship with a computer that's artificially intelligent, but in the end it's probably going to be as dissatisfying as it is for people to have a relationship with someone with a personality disorder, someone who is sociopathic. Okay? The other thing I find interesting is we like to think, so we don't need bodies. Relationship is just all about passing information to another person. But then why in the world have emojis gotten to be so popular in the texts and the emails and the things that we send? It's precisely because we're trying to make up in our technologically mediated communication for the lack of a body, to have some way to insert something that at least mimics a body in there because we recognize that just passing information on to another person leaves a whole dimension of information missing. Okay, so this brings me back then to this view of immortality, in which we capture the information in our brains, port it up into a computer, and get to live for a long time. And by the way, to quote Bob Russell again, as he once said to me, you know, eternity isn't just a long time. Okay? So, our Christian forebears, now for some theology, recognized what science shows now, that both to think and to love requires bodily existence within an environment. So an immortality that would continue anything like the life we have known and anything like the selves that we are must be instantiated in a body. The Nicene Creed states that it's the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed states that we believe in the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. Although I notice with most of my theology students that when we talk about this, and I say, you know, you recite that in church, they're mostly all Catholic, since I teach at a Benedictine institution. What do we mean by that? They all kind of say, you know. And I say, we mean body, even though most of them are the kind of functional dualists that say, well, when you die, your soul goes to heaven. And you say, well, no, maybe not, okay? Theologian Reinhold Niebuhr notes that such a life must occur outside the bounds of material history. He considers our attempts to bring immortality about within the material and the historical bounds of this world to be a source of sin. He writes, man assumes that he can gradually transcend finite limitations until his mind becomes identical with universal mind. All of his intellectual and cultural pursuits, therefore, become infected with the sin of pride. The importance of a body is further captured in the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation, which posits a God who shares our physicality, and in doing so, sanctifies the body's fallibility and mortality, precisely that which the new dualists hope to escape. In the person of Jesus, God lives a fully human, fully physical life, a scandal to minds formed under an Aristotelian notion of perfection. The dreams of cybernetic immortality, including those of Kurzweil, seek a form of perfection and life everlasting within this world. But those dreams fail to capture the full nature of what it means to be human. Christians, particularly after Augustine, have been adamant that we cannot affect immortality through our own devices. While we have no scientific proof of an ultimate resurrection of the body, it is our best and only hope. So here I've laid out kind of the differences between the resurrection of the body and computer-aided transhumanism. Resurrection of the body happens outside of history and outside of time. Computer-aided transhumanism happens within history, and it lets us continue for a long time. Resurrection of the body is sanctified and transformed. For computer-aided transhumanism, the body is escaped. Resurrection, it is centered on love, that it is God's love that affects this resurrection and transformation. Computer-aided transhumanism, this is centered on intellect. Love is not central here. What's central is thought. And of course the difference, resurrection is affected by God, and computer-aided transhumanism is self-effective. Niebuhr writes the following: the Christian hope of the consummation of life and history is less absurd than alternate doctrines. Interestingly enough, this doctrine wasn't around when Niebuhr was writing, but what he writes, I think, fits it beautifully. It is less absurd than alternate doctrines which seek to comprehend and effect the completion of life by some power or capacity inherent in man and his history. Both the meaning of life and its fulfillment are ascribed to a center and source beyond ourselves. We can participate in the fulfillment of the meaning only if we do not seek too proudly to appropriate the meaning as our secure possession or to effect the fulfillment by our own power. The aim of science is to both understand and to control the material world. We cannot remain within that world and transcend it at the same time. Near the end of his life and failing in health, Niebuhr noted that our physical self is not an illness from which we can or should escape. And he said the following: if we recognize the human self is not equated with its mind, though the logical and analytic faculties of the mind are an instrument of its freedom over nature and history. And I think I can actually put this up for you. That was the earlier quotation. Okay. So let me come back here again. And if we know the self is intimately related to its body, but cannot be equated with its physical functions, we then are confronted with the final mystery of its capacity of transcendence over nature, over history, and even its own self. If the physical universe is all that exists, there is no human immortality. Yet as Niebuhr writes, if we are persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord, it may dissuade us from the idolatrous pursuit of false securities and redemptions in life and history, and give us grounds for hope, for a resurrection that captures the true fullness of our being. We are more than information. Yes, we are minds, but we are minds inseparable in this world from a body that allows us to interact with our environment, to be agents of change, and most of all, to love one another. A love that Niebuhr so well points out was demonstrated to us by Jesus, our Lord himself. Thank you so much for listening.
We have 5 minutes for brief questions from the floor before Ted takes over and gives his response.
Yes.
How would you say evolution affects your views, like particularly Teilhard's evolutionary views on consciousness within the material universe?
Well, I think evolution fits very well with my view, because my view of consciousness is, first of all, if you look simply at consciousness within a particular person, it develops and it changes. It is something that is constantly changing. We are Heraclitus's river, never the same from one second to another. And I think that fits very well with an evolutionary viewpoint, that consciousness is not something where you say, okay, the world went on and on and on and on, insert consciousness here, okay? It is instead something that has emerged and developed over time. Yes?
My question is about the soul and the mind and the need for a body after death. I think if you limit the soul to the mind, then you need a body after death to keep these other things, compassion, love, everything, talk about that.
Yeah.
But I think, doesn't that limit the soul then unnecessarily? Isn't the soul a larger reality than just these kind of processing things?
Yes and no. And I am going to be the first one to say I haven't got the foggiest notion really what's going to happen to us after death. I throw myself on the mercy of God and we'll just see what happens. I do think that Christianity has posited a form of immortality in which we remain separately identifiable beings. and in that case, I'm not sure we put too much of a limitation on the soul. However, if you look at more of the view of the mystics, who seem to take much more of a view that eventually we will simply dissolve into God's very being, become one with God, then I think you may say, well, yeah, in that case, a resurrection of the body seems to put some sort of limitation on us. One of the things that I think Christian theologians haven't thought too deeply about, but what I've often seen as a limitation in Christian thinking as compared to more Eastern thought, is that we seem to have viewed the biblical passages that speak of resurrection as this is a one-shot deal. Now you may say, well, not exactly. I mean, the Catholics who had the notion of purgatory didn't seem to think it was a one-shot deal. It had to happen all at once. But purgatory's kind of gone out of fashion. Okay? But there really isn't anything, I think, in the biblical text that says this is a one-shot deal. So here I would say another way of looking at it, and I'll quote Houston Smith, who said, well, he didn't know what was going to happen after death. But he felt at this point in his being that he said, I want to taste sugar, I don't want to be sugar. And so he said, I hope in something like the resurrection of the body, where I will still be Houston Smith to some extent, somewhat separable from others and from God. And he said, I think I may want to hang around in that state for quite some time. He said, however, I have the feeling that there will come a time, and these are Houston's words, when I'm no longer interested in what's going on earth, when I've lived through all of my relationships to their very fullest, and I will want to be sugar. So his view is that maybe this isn't a one-shot deal, that there could be a resurrection of the body, maybe multiple resurrections of the body, but that the final stage would probably be complete integration into God's very self. There are many ways of looking at this.
Brief comment from Reese, and we'll stop. Reese?
Okay.
Alfred North Whitehead said at one point that the self lives in the empty interstices of the cells of the brain. And so it always raised the question with me whether there was physical and electric and then emptiness, but emptiness still capable of having affectivities or factors.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Lao Tzu writes about how it's the hole in the hub of the wheel that allows the wheel to turn. It's that emptiness that actually makes the wheel functional. On the other hand, you could take a different reading of Whitehead, which I could take a Kurzweilian reading of Whitehead, and say, yes, he was on to the fact that the soul lives in the messages that are passed from neuron to neuron. In other words, the information that is found in our brains. And so he prefigured my view, which is that we are nothing but the information found in our brains. I don't think Whitehead does that. I think Whitehead is taking a much more mystical view there of what that emptiness actually entails.
You wanted so much to get into your brief question?
Yes, I'll make it brief. I have 3 comments, I'll make it just one. And that is the question of wisdom. And, I was thinking of the children in the sand, and how we hope that as we age, we'll become wise.
Yeah.
And so much of it has to do with experience after experience, and being open to that and changing to that.
Right.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, the Buddhists differentiate between empathy and compassion, and we can't think they're the same, that there are levels of response,
That's true.
and that compassion is in the levels of response.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a point well taken. On your first point, I often point out to my students who seem to think that they really don't need to study because they can Google everything
Uh-huh.
and it's all out there, that information does not equal knowledge and knowledge does not equal wisdom. That these are different things. And just to make one other comment, the child in the sandbox is gaining knowledge that is not just being filed away in her mind, it is also being filed away in her hands, in her muscles, and in the rest of her body. And I was thinking about the fact that we're so quick to think everything happens up here, but I got a very good reminder of that this morning as I was walking over here, and I was giving myself a little pep talk, okay, Noreen, you've given talks before, you're going to be fine, you have no reason to be nervous, have fun with this. And I managed to talk my head into pretty good agreement with that, but I got to tell you, my stomach had a completely different take on the matter. So there is learning, and there is thinking, and there's a whole lot of emotion going on in places besides in our heads.